Picture this. Spring 1999. A pristine white dress stands alone on a Paris runway. The model wearing it, Shalom Harlow, begins to spin slowly on a turntable, arms outstretched like a ballerina in a music box. Then, without warning, two industrial robots jerk to life. They're not sewing machines or mannequins, they're car factory paint sprayers, and they begin to assault the dress with jets of black and yellow paint while Tchaikovsky's Dying Swan plays through the speakers. The audience gasps. Some are horrified, others are mesmerized, and in that moment, fashion as we knew it was dead. This wasn't just a runway show. It was performance art. It was violence and beauty wrapped in tulle. It was Alexander McQueen saying to the world, "Fashion isn't just about pretty clothes. It's about making you feel something so deeply that you can't look away." Lee Alexander McQueen didn't just design clothes. He designed experiences that crawled under your skin and lived there. Before him, a fashion show was a trade presentation. Models walking, buyers scribbling orders, champagne flowing. After him, fashion shows became theater, became art, became something that could break your heart or haunt your dreams. But to understand how a working-class boy from East London transformed the most elite corridors of fashion into his personal stage, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to the glittering runways of Paris, but to a council flat in Stratford where a boy named Lee was already seeing the world differently than everyone else. 1969, East London. While other kids collected football cards, Lee McQueen was sketching dresses on the backs of his school notebooks. His father drove cabs. His mother was a social science teacher. This wasn't a family that summered in the Hamptons or knew what happened inside the ateliers of Paris. But young Lee had something more valuable than connections. He had an eye that saw beauty in violence, romance in decay, and theater in everything. At 16, he left school and walked into Savile Row, the heart of British tailoring, and talked his way into an apprenticeship. Anderson and Shepherd, Jeeves and Hawkes. These were the places that dressed royalty, where a suit could cost more than his father made in 6 months. Lee learned to cut fabric like a surgeon, to build structure into cloth that could transform a body. But more importantly, he learned the rules, every single one of them, because as he'd later say, "You've got to know the rules to break them. That's what I'm here for, to demolish the rules but keep the tradition." By the time he reached Central St. Martin's, London's legendary fashion school, in 1992, Lee wasn't just skilled. He was angry at a fashion world that felt safe, predictable, bourgeois. His graduate collection was called Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. The clothes were slashed, bloodied, brutal. They told the story of Victorian women and violence, but really they were about something else. They were about Lee Alexander McQueen announcing that fashion could be dangerous. Isabella Blow saw that graduate show. Isabella, fashion editor, aristocrat, woman who wore lobsters on her head and thought nothing of it. She saw something in those torn dresses that nobody else did. She bought the entire collection, paid £5,000 in installments, which to Lee might as well have been $5 million. But more than money, Isabella gave him permission to be exactly as wild, as theatrical, as disturbing as he wanted to be. She told him to use Alexander instead of Lee. It sounded more luxurious, more international. She became his patron saint, his champion, his gateway into a world that should have rejected him but couldn't resist him. 1995, the Highland Rape Collection. Even the name was a provocation. Models stumbled down the runway in torn lace and exposed breasts, looking like they'd survived something unspeakable. The fashion press went insane. Half called it misogynistic, the other half called it genius. But McQueen knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about glorifying violence against women. It was about the rape of Scotland by England, about his own Scottish heritage, about how history itself is an act of violence. "I want to empower women," he said. "I want people to be afraid of the women I dress." But here's what the critics missed while they were clutching their pearls. McQueen wasn't just putting on fashion shows anymore. He was creating theater. Each collection was a 3-act play, complete with narrative, character, and emotional arc. The models weren't just walking, they were performing. The runway wasn't just a platform, it was a stage. And then came the call that changed everything. 1996. John Galliano had just left Givenchy for Dior, and the venerable French house needed a new creative director. They chose McQueen. 27 years old, working class, barely spoke French, and suddenly he was designing haute couture for one of Paris's most prestigious houses. The fashion establishment was horrified. How could this British savage be trusted with French elegance? McQueen hated every minute of it. He called it crap in interviews. He said the couture clients were bourgeois and had no taste. But what Givenchy gave him was resources. Suddenly, he had budgets that could support his visions. He could build sets, hire teams, create the spectacles that were burning in his imagination. Because back in London, his own label was evolving into something unprecedented. The shows weren't just getting bigger, they were becoming experiences that redefined what fashion could be. Take Spring-Summer 1999. The show that opened with that paint-splattered dress, the one where robots became artists and destruction became creation. McQueen had been inspired by Rebecca Horn's painting machines, but what he created was pure theater. It took a week to program those robots. Every spray of paint was choreographed. The model, Shalom Harlow, was chosen specifically because she had ballet training. She could maintain grace while being assaulted by machines. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or cry. Some did both. Or consider Voss, Spring-Summer 2001. The entire show took place inside a mirrored cube. For the first hour, the audience stared at their own reflections, growing increasingly uncomfortable. They couldn't see inside. They didn't know if anything was happening. They became the spectacle, forced to confront their own vanity. Then the lights changed, the mirrors became transparent, and inside was a padded cell, an asylum. Models wandered through it like patients, beautiful and deranged. And at the center, breathing through a tube, was a naked woman covered in moths. It was inspired by Joel Peter Whitkin's photography, but it was pure McQueen, beauty and madness and death all wrapped up in silk and tulle. The technical precision required for these shows was staggering. McQueen would rehearse for weeks. Every model's expression was directed. Every stumble was choreographed. He wasn't interested in improvisation. He was creating theater, and theater demands perfection. For Scanners, Autumn/Winter 2003, he installed wind machines so powerful they could have lifted the models off the ground. The clothes billowed and whipped. The models' hair became wild, and for 10 minutes, the audience felt like they were inside a hurricane. But the show that perhaps best captured McQueen's fusion of technology, emotion, and spectacle was Widows of Culloden, Autumn/Winter 2006. The collection was about his Scottish heritage, about loss and mourning and the weight of history. Models walked through a runway wearing clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from a 19th century Highland funeral. Philip Treacy created headdresses that looked like birds' nests. Everything was romantic and ghostly and melancholic. And then came the finale. A giant glass pyramid appeared at the end of the runway. Inside it, an image began to form. Kate Moss, floating, ethereal, wearing a rippling gown that seemed to be made of water itself. The audience gasped. It looked like a hologram from the future, but it was actually a 19th century illusion called Pepper's Ghost. McQueen had spent weeks with technicians mapping projections, aligning mirrors, getting the angle exactly right. Kate had to perform the piece live, in real time, hidden beneath the stage. She appeared for maybe 30 seconds, this ghost of beauty, and then vanished. But this wasn't just spectacle for spectacle's sake. Kate Moss had been McQueen's friend for years. In 2005, she'd been photographed allegedly using cocaine, and the fashion world had turned on her. Contracts were canceled. She was called a disgrace. McQueen was one of the only designers who stood by her. This ghostly appearance was his way of saying, "You tried to kill her, but she's still here. More beautiful than ever. Untouchable." This was McQueen's gift. He could take personal pain, historical trauma, political anger, and transform it into something so beautiful it hurt to look at. His shows weren't just about clothes. They were about England's rape of Scotland, about his mother's genealogy, about his own struggles with his body, his sexuality, his place in a world that wanted to own him but never understand him. The fashion establishment didn't know what to do with him. His shows made headlines, but they also made enemies. He was too much, too angry, too real. While other designers were selling aspiration, McQueen was selling truth, and truth doesn't always photograph well in Vogue. After he left Givenchy in 2001, "It was crap, Yul," he said. "I hope someone burns the building down." He focused entirely on his own label. The Gucci Group, which had bought a majority stake in his company in 2000, gave him the resources to realize his visions fully. The shows moved to Paris, became even more elaborate. For Plato's Atlantis, spring-summer 2010, he live-streamed the entire show online, a first for fashion. The clothes seemed to morph between human and amphibian. Models walked on impossible armadillo shoes, and the whole thing felt like watching evolution in reverse. It would be his last show. February 11th, 2010, the day before his mother's funeral. Lee Alexander McQueen hanged himself in his Mayfair apartment. He was 40 years old. The suicide note he left was addressed to his dogs. The fashion world went into mourning, but it felt hollow somehow. All these people who'd called him difficult, who'd complained about his shows being too dark, too violent, too much, suddenly they all claimed to have understood him all along. But here's what they missed, what they're still missing. McQueen didn't kill himself because fashion was too hard, or because he was tortured by his genius. He killed himself because his mother died, because Isabella Blow had killed herself 3 years earlier, because the two women who truly saw him were gone. Without them, the theater had no audience that mattered. The shows McQueen created weren't just ahead of their time. They existed outside of time altogether. He took fashion, which is supposed to be about surfaces, about beauty, about aspiration, and he made it about truth. Ugly truth. Beautiful truth. Truth that made you uncomfortable in your front row seat. Watch any fashion show today. Really watch it. The elaborate sets, the narrative structures, the attempt to create moments that will go viral. It all comes from McQueen. But what's missing is the danger. The feeling that something real is at stake, that the designer is ripping open their chest and showing you their beating heart. McQueen once said, "I want to be the purveyor of a certain silhouette or a way of cutting so that when I'm dead and gone, people will know that the 21st century was started by Alexander McQueen." But he did something bigger than that. He proved that fashion could be art, that a runway could be a stage, that clothes could tell stories that matter. The robots that painted Shalom Harlow's dress in 1999 weren't just machines. They were metaphors for how technology transforms beauty, how creation and destruction are the same act, how even in violence there can be grace. That's what McQueen understood that nobody else did. Fashion isn't about clothes. It never was. It's about transformation. It's about taking the human body, with all its flaws and desires and secrets, and turning it into something else, something dangerous, something divine. Every designer since has tried to capture that same magic. They hire the same set designers, use the same projection technology, create the same dramatic finales, but they're missing the essential ingredient: the willingness to bleed in public. McQueen didn't just design fashion shows. He performed autopsies on his own soul and invited everyone to watch. That's why, more than a decade after his death, we're still talking about a dress being painted by robots, about Kate Moss floating in a pyramid, about models stumbling through asylum cells. Because these weren't fashion shows. They were exorcisms. They were seances. They were Alexander McQueen showing us that fashion at its best isn't about what you wear. It's about what you survive. The lights never really came up after a McQueen show. You left the venue changed, disturbed, moved in ways you couldn't quite articulate. You'd seen something you weren't supposed to see. You'd felt something you weren't supposed to feel. And that feeling would follow you home, slip into your dreams, make you question everything you thought you knew about beauty, about art, about the very nature of transformation itself. That was his gift to us. Not the clothes, though they were magnificent. Not the shows, though they were revolutionary. But the permission to see fashion as something more than commerce, more than vanity, more than empty spectacle. He turned fashion shows into theater, yes, but more than that, he turned them into mirrors. Dark, beautiful, terrible mirrors that showed us exactly who we are, and we're still afraid to look.